Hello again. Hi, everybody. Hi. I have the distinct pleasure of moderating the last conversation from these 2 wonderful days that we've had. And you've probably noticed, like I have, that many of the conversations over the last few days have spanned generations, geographical locations, from students who became teachers and their students are here. And then we've got the ex-lovers and other people in the room. There were sleepovers, there were road trips, all kinds of things, right? So anyway, Deborah has created community. And I think that's really evident from what's in the room, a kind of community that has a lot of emotional resonance. So for the final conversation today, we've got 3 wonderful colleagues and friends who are going to answer to some questions that I developed around thinking through the engagements from the day, but also in relation to their own projects, how they're thinking about transformation as a political project, as a social project, and then some storytelling about encounters with Britzman, because we like to have that as well. So I'm going to welcome our 3 participants. Angela Facundo is an assistant professor in the English department at Queen's University and a registered psychotherapist in private practice in Toronto. Her book, Oscillations of Literary Theory, The Paranoid Imperative and Queer Reparative, is part of the SUNY book series Transforming Subjects, Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Studies in Education. Welcome, Angela. Dina Georgis is Associate Professor in the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Her work is situated in the fields of post-colonial and sexuality studies and psychoanalysis. Her new book, provisionally titled Making Use of Objects, Play and Radical Witnessing of War, explores what it means to ethically witness others as engaged subjects, composing themselves and their surrounding worlds in large and small acts of play. And Ronaldo Walcott is professor and Carl V. Granger Chair of Africana and American Studies in the Department of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. Ronaldo is chair of the department, and Ronaldo has a long list of accolades that he didn't give to us, but we know what they are. So the first prompt I gave was to think about transformation as a political, aesthetic, and/or psychosocial dynamic in your own work. And I think we'll start with Angela and then Dina and Ronaldo. And then after that, we might have more of an organic kind of flow. Give to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this question was actually quite daunting for me to think about, because even the word transformation just sounds so aspirational, and I could only think about it in terms of failures and hiccups and questions and impasses as we all attempt to kind of haltingly adapt to change. So I have 3 scenes for you in my work, in my research. I'm preoccupied with tracking or reading paradigm shifts in how we read. And right now, I'm tracking, in particular, this now decade-long debate about having to choose between a kind of anti-social critique or post-critical or reparative reading, and people kind of battle it out. And I think this long immobilization has something to do with the wish to come up with a theory of reading that enables us to sustain a capacity to think in a way that matches the rate of mounting anxiety in light of global catastrophe. So that's my work and how transformation is kind of halting there. In the second scene, so I teach literary theory at Queen's, and last week, this is a current crisis in English especially, and Sarah, you'll be interested in this. My TAs came to me so indignant with all of this evidence that our students use ChatGPT for for their take-home exams. And so we were in the meeting, I was in my office, I was calming them down, and I told them to delete all of the accusations on their comments in the papers. Like, we have to strategize about how to actually respond to this. But we had to move to class. But the thing is, in that meeting, I caught their hate and their paranoia. So in the classroom, I was dealing with this question, to Britzman's point yesterday: if reading and writing is the best of education, what do I have left in the English classroom? Because not only do I have to deal with the frustration of, and tolerating the frustration of students not reading their work, but now we have technologies that write for them. And this technology in particular changes fundamentally their relationship to signification. There is no repetition compulsion because they're not doing the repeating, and there is no compulsion to work through. And I don't know if the space that I'm entering into is a space of love and hate, which I've spent the last decade trying to get used to, or if it's a space of indifference. And I would never be able to tell because of this simulacrum of readerly interiority. So all of this was going through my mind as I was walking to class, and coincidentally, I was teaching Kristeva's Revolution in Poetic Language. And so I was trying to keep the accusations and the persecutory feelings away from the lecture, but I ended up talking about the importance of the thetic phase. And I was doing this and not doing this, but the thetic experiences are really important, moving from the semiotic drive to know, to the symbolic entrance into language. And generative AI technologies take away these thetic experiences. And I said this to these blank faces. I'm not sure if they're poker faced because they don't want to respond to the hail or what. And so I do wonder that if a warm pedagogy moves away from persecution and humiliation, and if we have to lose, drawing from Deborah's words yesterday, I'm wondering how to lose while still beckoning the students in a good enough way to experience contact with the incoherent, because it's a literary theory class, in difficult knowledge. And then in the clinic, I'm still trying to think about and figure it out how to write about clinical material in an ethical way, away from the narrative of rupture and repair or impasse and breakthrough, and what does transformation look like outside of that narrative structure.
I have more of a prepared response to Sarah's prompt. So it's a difficult question for me to answer, to think about how transformation is a political, aesthetic, and a psychosocial dynamic in my work, because I feel like that is all I've ever done in my academic career, probably because I was I experienced political traumas in my childhood, and it's been a lifetime of, I think, kind of thinking through and working through what that has meant. And Deborah taught me a lot about how to think about trauma and loss, and about our relationship to knowledge and knowability and its limits and its uncertainties. But at a certain point, I think I started to feel locked into loss, if you will, and kind of needed a way to think about the psychosocial and potentiality through more, it's not, I was going to say creative ways of being. That's not to say that trauma doesn't express itself creatively, and that's certainly the topic of my first book. But I wanted something else, and so I turned to play as a way to get there. And Sharon was talking about dreams, and I think that there's definitely a relationship between dreaming and playing. And so I'm wanting to think about the ways in which change happens through ways that are through pleasure and joy, actually. So that's how I got myself locked out of loss and trauma is through playing, dreaming, and joy and pleasure. And that's not to say I don't want to expunge loss and trauma, obviously, from that, but I just wanted a different starting point, if you will. So now I'll just read a little bit. So in psychoanalysis, play, which begins in childhood, is a means through which individuals process their experiences and emotions. It allows for curious exploration, experimentation, and the expression of desires and anxieties under a good enough environment. According to Andre Green, play, this is a quote, plays to change reality into something else, something that transforms what is unbearable in reality, be it internal or external. Play is the utilizing of the imagination in ordinary and extraordinary free expression. Play is always exciting, and children play for no decipherable purpose other than the desire to play, to experiment, and to feel pleasure. Play enacts our ordinary genius responsible for small acts of poetry. In play, we enunciate and engage from a place that is other to what is legible or legitimate. It is often an act of refusal to the conditions of existence, but it is not easily readable, especially to the one that is doing the playing. Play is, however, always available to us in abundance, even when it's really hard to play. When we are playing, we are in spontaneous communication, not making concessions to external reality or acceding to its defining and limiting ways. We are composing new realities all the time, escaping totalizations, outlining our inventions against what knowably exists. This capacity for play, which is also our capacity for aesthetic possibility, is our ontological performance of freedom and is at the root of, in my mind, psychosocial transformation for both the individual and the collective. As I see it, all play is aesthetic, even if it may not present as aesthetic as we understand the term. The aesthetic is a form of speech without rational transparency. It expresses the unintelligible, but as Catherine McKittrick states in her writings on Black aesthetics, it is not about claiming vagueness or unintelligibility. The aesthetic embodies a relation to opacity, to what is not easily readable or objectifiable. When we practice an aesthetic method, we invite ourselves to experience and witness human expression as a prompt and a demand, and maybe even a screaming demand, as Glissant would have it. The aesthetics, so the aesthetics screams our freedom, if you will, our imaginative interventions, and our psychic demand for a life worth living. And this is why I think we need to think about play even in the darkest times, even when there are, we're living in really terrible times as there's, witnessing genocides in Palestine and in Lebanon and Yemen and Sudan. And I think that this is, for me, it is actually really important to think about play in the darkest of times. Yes, these desires and impulses do not die under horrific conditions, though they may be seriously compromised and suffocated. Indeed, under times of crisis, despair can charge us into play and into action.
Okay. I kind of feel like we should have had this rolled out and a beautiful couch rolled in here so that we could really have this conversation. I kind of feel like the way I want to answer this first question is to think about it in retrospective, which is to say something specifically to Deborah that I think she might intuit, but has never been said publicly and clearly. But I owe my career to Deborah. And I owe my career to Deborah because when I was a graduate student, I took that first course with Barbara. And I was writing a dissertation on hip hop. Deborah said to me, "There's a colleague that I have at Binghamton. Her name is Carl Boyce Davies, and she should be your external examiner." And Deborah proceeded to make that happen. And Carl has been everything to me in my career since then, in terms of being a Black Studies scholar who did not go anywhere to any school that had anything like Black Studies because it just didn't exist in Canada. And then Deborah introduced me to my good and now lifelong friend, Warren Critchlow, who I then got hitched up with my good friend, Cass Bannon, but, So Roger, and I owe so much to Deborah and to Roger. And of course, in that particular moment, So many people that Deborah and Roger brought through the city. Patty, who's here when she was doing her work on women and AIDS, and so on. But for a while, when I became Deborah's colleague here at York in 1995, I didn't live very far from her. She lived on Witchwood, and Kasia and I, before I became fully gay, when I was just a baby bisexual, we lived above the porn shop on Sinclair. And in those years, Deborah and I had spent lots of time in conversation at Dooney's Cafe on Bloor Street, but also just in our neighborhood. And, whether it was reading the Sunday New York Times together, or going to Buddies in Bad Time to see plays, or to Harborfront to see dance, or listening to classical music. Deborah and I engaged in these long, extended conversations. I remember long conversations about Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. And I want to say all of that to say that in retrospect, one begins to see the impact that another person has had on your intellectual life and your life of the mind. And sometime in the late 1990s, I even found myself smoking unfiltered Camels. So, but I also remember Deborah excitedly telling me, "Come over to the house. My full volume of Freud's work has arrived. come and see it." And I say all of that to get to the first time that I tried to write a paper and to think with psychoanalysis was probably around 1996 or 1997. The MLA was coming to Toronto, and I had embarked after my graduate work to try to write a book on the Middle Passage, the impossibility of representing the Middle Passage. And I wrote this paper for the MLA, and Deborah and I basically workshopped it until she felt like it was right now. You can go and present it now, right? And so from that moment, I spent a number of years reading psychoanalysis, thinking about psychoanalysis. And by 2001, the late Roger Simon and the late Sharon Rosenberg and Claudia Eppert edited a book called Between Hope and Despair, and a paper that I published an essay in that book that comes out of some of that thinking around questions of trauma and so on. But then shortly after that, I broke with psychoanalysis, and Dina will know this because at the time, you, myself, Trish, and Gamal will run around Queen's Park in the early mornings and then have coffee and debate ideas. And I gave up on psychoanalysis shortly around maybe 2001. I had a break. I was like, I'm leaving psychoanalysis. I can't answer the questions I needed to answer. But there's a funny thing about psychoanalysis. Once you've engaged with it, you actually can't leave it behind. So what stayed with me was the kind of language and poetics of psychoanalysis. And in terms of psychoanalytic thinkers, the person who stayed with me the most and continues to stay with me is Melanie Klein. And for the other questions, I'll come back. You'll hear why Melanie Klein stays with me. But the question of reparation and the question of desire continues to underwrite the work that I do.
I knew Ronaldo would have juicy things to say. I'm sure there's more. Thank you. So we might come back to some of those ideas, I think, around transformation and the links between some of the comments you made. But let's move on to the second prompt, which was to ask you to think about a story of an engagement with Britzman's work that led to an idea. And do you want to go again with the same order? Mm-hmm.
Yes. Actually, I'm going to pick up on Klein there. So I read After Education about 2009, 8 or 9, in Deborah's grad course on psychoanalysis and education. And it was deeply influential to me because it's the first book in which I discovered that Britzman is an incredible reader and redescriber of Melanie Klein. And that reading, her reading, gave me a way of understanding reparation that involved difficult thinking, contact with the incoherent, risk, and most importantly, loneliness. And I think loneliness will, I think, at least I'm thinking about my students, I think it will be ever more dominating for them. And her reading also gave me the vocabulary that allowed me to loosen my grip on the language of the drive without letting it go or discarding it altogether, especially the language of the death drive, because up until that point, the answer of the death drive, its inevitability started to depress me. And so Britzman gave me her book and she's like, here. and it really dislodged my thinking. And I continue to kind of use Britzman's work to keep me grounded in that. Like when I'm engaging in this debate. So this led to my book, Paranoid Imperative and Queer Reparative, in which I talk about a theory of reading that says that the oscillation between the paranoid position and depressive position is necessary. You can't choose one or the other. You have to integrate both in this process. And so I took a 4-year break from academia, and upon my return, this debate has just been further instantiated. And part of the reason why, I think, is because people who engage in this debate are turning away from deep psychoanalytic engagement. And so I'm trying to develop a post-critical psychoanalysis of reading that uses Britzman's work as a kind of North Star. And an example of this is one of the players in this debate, Patricia Stolke in Roots of Repair, characterizes Klein's, she draws from David Eng's kind of biographical reading of Melanie Klein, and characterizes the reparative as a neoliberal denial of aggression or disavowal of aggression, and reproduction of colonial violence under the narrative of who is worthy of repair and who isn't. And I, if you contrast that with Britzman's work, even her introduction to Melanie Klein, she really emphasizes that we can only know our education when we face our proclivities to depression and the difficult fantasies that come out of agony. So it's not, the reparative is not an easy thing to do, and it often maybe doesn't make us happy. Like it's the way that the field is characterizing and repudiating the concept of reparation doesn't really take a reading of Melanie Klein's ideas to heart the way that Britzman's work does. So I keep that in mind. And the other thing that comes out of that book related to this is the idea of theory kindergarten. If theory never leaves kindergarten, then kindergarten never leaves theory. And so this kind of idea of not being able to hold on to mastery for very long. And it reminds me of when I was training to become a psychotherapist at the TICP, and I was kind of whining to Deborah over dinner, whining to Deborah about some kind of banal institutional subjection. And I said, they're treating us like we're in diapers. And then Deborah's like, you are in diapers. And I was like, oh, yeah. Oh, God, how embarrassing. So yeah, but it's like that tracks. That's how I feel when I'm like in, facing clients who are in deep distress and deep agony, and all of my theoretical apparatus that I developed through academia over the last decade was, it felt useless. So being in diapers and theory kindergarten is where I am. Thanks to Deborah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about stories to respond to this question about a story with Deborah. Before I offer you a story about my engagement with Britzman's work, I want to share with you an older story about my father. On long nights during the Civil War in Lebanon, when we had no water and no power for months at a time and no one to play with because families had evacuated their homes, my father would tell us, my younger sister and I, stories to keep us occupied and entertained. Every night we would huddle up against him on my parents' bed, excited to hear the next chapter of a story that would never end. I reckon he drew on the stories and traditions of storytelling from 1001 Nights. My father never played with us. He was a man of his generation. So these months of storytelling were very, very uncharacteristic. It never happened before the war and never after we left Lebanon, but it's a memory I have cherished my whole life. Fast track to 2024, my six-year-old daughter, Rue, has never been able to sit still and eat a meal at the dinner table without her mind being engaged in some way. To avoid engaging her mind with a screen, I've taken to telling her stories. Last year, when we were out with our sperm donor, Aziz, not the Aziz in the room here, who has become a family member, Rue asked him and I to tell her naughty childhood stories. And I was not much of a naughty child, but we indulged her that afternoon, and so began the new habit of telling her stories. I began with naughty stories about my sister Wanda was very naughty, so I started telling her naughty Wanda stories, and from there I started telling her naughty Noah stories, her 15-year-old cousin. And just recently, she's asked for Rue naughty stories, but then she took it back. She wasn't quite ready. These are pretend stories that I would make up from thin air, but we became co-creators of them. I would just make up a story. So night after night, I would make up these stories, and it started to get really tiring. Anyway, at the time, I had wrongly assumed that she would want the stories to arrive at some closure, to enjoy the feeling of resolution, maybe because the formula of every children's film I've seen seems to do that. But a couple of months ago, she started to insist that we don't end the story, but continue the next night from where we had left off. I couldn't believe it. What did she find so pleasurable in a story that would never end? And did I somehow unconsciously transmit something to her? Britzman, in a collection edited by Roger Simon, Sharon Rosenberg, and Claudia Eppert, and Ronaldo published his really lovely article in that collection, wrote a beautiful essay on Anne Frank titled If the Story Cannot End, Deferred Action, Ambivalence, and Difficult Knowledge, where she considered the emotional significance of narrating and re-narrating difficult experience. Anne Frank's story is interminable, sketched and resketched from the unassimilated traces of her experience between this essay and a line in Jan Martel's novel Life of Pi on what it means to narrate the better story of a tragedy. My book, The Better Story, Queer Affects from the Middle East, was born. I stitched these two ideas to suggest that when we narrate events that injure us, be they personal or collective, the story is our lifeline. But if the story ends there, if we hold on to it in defense of change, we get stuck in emotional fixities. The consequences, I argued, have significant political implications.
You weren't a naughty child, so you became a naughty adult.
You know me well.
How to answer this or respond to this? I mean, I'll think it this way. I've learned a number of things from Deborah in conversation and in her work. And of course, everybody's talked about difficult knowledge. And the encounter with that idea shaped the foundation of my work and how I go about thinking about the difficulty of Blackness in the world. But there are a couple of other things that are they're codified in Deborah's books, but I know them from engagement and conversation, which is something about reading not for representation, but for the trouble that it can cause you. Or thinking about queer possibility as unmoored from queer affirmation. Or the shock of her conveying to me that ignorance was a particular kind of knowledge. And these kinds of things have come to sit at the foundation of my work. And there's an idea that I try to work with, there are two ideas I try to work with, which are very much founded in these moments. The first is, what would it take for us to live better together collectively? And yesterday, when Hannah and Casey invoked this idea of the risk of solidarity, that's often what I'm trying to get at. What kind of politics can we produce that does not require representation, but requires taking risks to refuse affirmation, but still to share something in common. I believe that might allow us to figure out how to live better together. And I ground these explorations in Blackness, because I think that Blackness is the kind of quality that so people find impossible to live with outside of feeling that they have to affirm it. And I don't think Black life needs affirmation. Black life needs something else. And the other is this idea of freedom that I've been working with now for 5, 6, maybe 8 years. And most of the time when I write the word desire, I mean to write the word freedom, which is to say that freedom is an ongoing, unfolding project that is always just a little bit ahead of us, and we're never reaching it. But if we keep working towards it, we work towards this idea of living better collectively together. So, but to be unmoored from affirmation is to risk something. And I'm really interested in risk. I'm really interested in what kind of psychic scaffolding we need to have to risk solidarity, to say that beyond the self, there's something more that we can connect with. And of course, that takes me right back to Fanon and the last sentence in Black Skin, White Mask, which is "Make of me a man who always dreams," which is a kind of collective call to leave Black nightmare behind and take that leap of invention into a different kind of sociality. So, of course, I say all of that because I remember the long discussions, debates, disagreements on the rereading of Fanon in the 1990s. What's her name? Her name just went right on my head. It'll come back to me. But anyhow, I'll stop there. God, her name just went right on my head.
Yeah, I'm really struck by, something you are just articulated, Ronaldo, and that has come up in the way that all three of you talked about the ideas, right, that you gleaned from working with Deborah's writing and other kinds of engagements with her, was politics as relation. And it's something I think that has come up in the last couple of days, but we haven't named it as such, perhaps, or that's not the language maybe that we're using. So the last prompt I had asked you to engage was maybe reflecting on the last couple of days, a kernel of insight and or something that you think still remains to be said, or if there's some way to further articulate or substantiate that kind of ethics, the kind of politics, the kind of storying, that you're working with around moving into transformation, taking risk, bringing psychoanalysis, psychosocial questions into the material world in ways that make a difference for people's lives beyond what we call the human, right? Sorry, is that too big of a question?
No, is this the last question?
This is the last
Okay, then I got it. I got it. I don't know about you, but I'm in a dream state at this point, and perhaps it's the best time to reflect on the remains of this day and yesterday. But I think this experience in this room is an experience of relation, like across time, space, generation, and I don't remember the last time I felt so alive in in a meeting of minds. Oh, I do remember. It was Deborah's last event. So it's been many, many years. And I think hearing everyone's work and stories, I think we're all, if I'm reflecting on relation, I think we're all trying to say in our various ways, thank you. But we're also trying to think about how we help everyone deal with a kind of intractable dependency, how we defend against it and how we kind of move through it. I think we're also, we express gratitude for you're helping us feel okay with our utter dependency on you throughout our entire career and not be so defeated by that. And so as I think about the future that we cannot know, and move into, I'm thinking about the awesome task of continuing this work, and kind of returning to this feeling, whatever we felt in the last couple of days, because it has value. I feel like if we can transmit even just a trace of what you're able to give us, that's good enough work.
Sarah, I'm glad you ended with relationality, because that is what I've been thinking about in the last couple of days, and especially today. I was a little bit haunted by Deborah's idea yesterday of tolerating the other, and that's just kind of stuck with me the last 2 days. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how we can, I think it seems to me that maybe when there is a meltdown, so I'm just going to use some of the language that what you've used in the last years, when there is a meltdown, Karen, you gave us examples of a meltdown. Karen gave us an interesting example of a meltdown with her student. And I think that, Karen, you tolerated that student's affect and gave her space then to do something else with it. So I think what I was first disturbed by the idea of just tolerating, someone's otherness. And then I started thinking maybe that's just the first iteration. And then after that, is it possible then that we get to play with them if we can hold that space? And I think, Karen, I would say that maybe what happened there is a kind of playful interaction that maybe led to some kind of change for that student, something that was meaningful. And then I was just you were talking about, is it risking solidarity? Was that the phrase that Ken and Casey? Yeah. So again, it's tolerating but then risking. So it's more involved, I think. And then when you risk, I think the potential for change and playfulness really becomes possible, even though you don't know where that's going to go. And then I'm thinking about Deborah's warm pedagogy, and that led me to also think, because I think this is also a warm way of relating. I think what I'm describing is perhaps a warm way of relating, but that led me to think about how we translate a warm pedagogy into a warm politics. What does that look like? And maybe you can answer that question. I give you that one.
I'm actually going to go in a very
different direction. Okay.
Than both of you.
All right. Okay. And what else do I have here? What's that? What's warm politics? I guess maybe I answered it already, that we don't quickly, we try to resist reaction formations. We tolerate the meltdown. We risk uncertainty, and we start to play, maybe, if all that goes okay.
I think, Sarah, your question allows me to do a return, and return is one of the words that has repeatedly returned in this conversation. And so let me do this return. When I broke with psychoanalysis, I returned to Sylvia Wynter, and I returned to her work on the problem of the human. And as we all know, Wynter argues that European conceptions of the human simply can't contain the Black. And in the last decade or more, a subfield of Black studies, Afro-pessimism, has gone even further than Wynter and said the Black is not human at all. And there's no need to try to recuperate the category of the human, because that category, as Frank Wilderson III argues, produces a void of non-relation for the Black, right? And so while I'm not entirely an Afro-pessimist, I'm deeply persuaded by many of the arguments that they make. So that has returned me to my work on reparations that I began earlier in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and a series of essays that I've written on questions of Euro-American humanism or on the contemporary reparations movement. I'm slowly returning to psychoanalysis because one can see very clearly how Black life is being totally economized and arithmetized. And by doing that, the kind of question of the interiority of Black life has gone missing. So and the place where one can find a re-engagement with the interiority of Black life is in Afro-pessimist thought, where scholars like Frank Wilderson, Jerry Sexton, Salome Watt Terife, and particularly David Marriott, his particularly last 3 books, Whether Fanon, Haunted Life, and Lacan Noir, have really kind of opened up the long-standing poetics and language of psychoanalysis in some aspects of Black studies that haven't been really reckoned with. And so Marriott has become a really important figure for me to teach and think with and work with. And sometime like a year or two ago, I published an essay in a special section, New Centennial Review on Reparations that he organized, and I'm thinking and talking about reparation because I think reparations beyond the economize opens up something that might allow other people to risk solidarity with Black people in ways that might be deeply meaningful. And recently on a panel with Warren, I'm trying to think about the kind of question of what does Black art do in the moment of reparations. So I'm thinking about Black art as a form, as a reparations of, as reparations art, not because the artist says that they're engaged in the project of reparations, but what does it mean to read Black art in this particular historical moment when reparations is a part of the significant political landscape. And again, for me, what becomes at stake is a kind of question of what constitutes a life and whether or not we can talk about a life, the species life, outside the category of the human. So in one of my last books, I refused the category of the human in my book, The Long Emancipation. And instead I used the term the Black life form as a way to get outside of that totally corrupted category that simply, I believe, cannot be recuperated, especially as we see now in Lebanon, in the Congo, in the Sudan, and in Palestine. An appeal to humanism is, and maybe all we can do is reside in failure if we want to hold on to that category. But I think there's something beyond failure. And this is where I run into trouble because then I'm not a spiritualist, but there's a strain of Black feminism that turns towards spirituality, which I'm uneasy about. But I do think that we come up against a kind of larger question of what animates life. And I think the category of the human doesn't allow us to get there. We got 15 minutes left.
Well, do you two want to talk about Ronaldo with each other for a minute? Any lingering thoughts? As Warren used to say, I'm going to call out Warren. He used to come into the doc seminar room and say, "Are brains sparkling in here? I see things happening." I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to give you an opening if you'd like one.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm thinking about when you said the human as a category that is not recuperable. I think back to that vignette that I gave, and I'm wondering about, like, I you know, ChatGPT, generative AI is, I think I'm dealing with a crisis here, because I don't want to read a piece of work that is not human, you know, and maybe there's an ideality that I've internalized about what a student's humanity or interiority means, and I'm trying to think about how to respond to this new technology that offers a kind of, in a way, it's a life form, but it's a post-human residue. So I'm just wondering about that.
You know, I think, if I may,
Yeah.
both Sharon and Claudia's papers, I think, work with the trouble of trying to place this thing we call the human back into, I'm going to put it this way, it's proper placed in the larger environment. And of course, AI is a failure of that attempt. AI is the most brilliant failure of that attempt, because AI actually thinks that it will free the human, that it becomes that perfectibility. But what it's going to do, it's going to kill the human, right? The human is dead. But having said that, I'm less interested in like rescuing the human and trying to figure out what kinds of languages we might need, or we can invent that would allow us to leap beyond the categories that your American humanism has given us, that have us in all the trouble that we're in. Because all those categories are failures, but all those categories are continually orienting us towards a particular kind of death drive that ultimately, that ultimately leads to the production of the AI that's going to kill us.
It's the return of the death drive.
Yeah. So once you encounter psychoanalysis, you can't leave it.
Are you thinking, Dina, or are you tired?
Well, no, I'm thinking. Also tired, maybe. I mean, you know, of course I don't. I'm with you, Ronaldo, about the category of the human and all its troubles. But you know, you mentioned, you know, versions of spirituality among Black feminists, which is, you know, I understand your ambivalence, but I'm just wondering if there's a different way to think about spirituality that helps us, I don't know, like tether us together differently, so that, I don't know, you know, you know, I was raised in a religious context, and there's still a really, I have an attachment to an idea of some version of a universal that I can't let go of. I actually even remember, I don't know, maybe you and Deborah won't remember this, but in my defense, my doctoral defense, many moons ago now, where I was so self-conscious about my commitments to, or my commitments to universality, and all of you asked me to embrace it, but I never actually did. So I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you know, I don't want to be naive about it, and that's probably why I never took it up, because I just don't want to seem like I'm naive about human connection. But you were talking about solidarity, which tells me that underneath that is a kind of connection that we have to one another. You know, that exceeds like the terrible histories and genealogies of the human. That's all. I don't know. That's all I have to say.
I mean, I would say that I walk in between an interestingly strange intellectual space, which is that Winter argues that we need to bring a new world into existence. The Afro-pessimists argue that we need to end this world, right? And it's a world ending that's very different from the logics of the Anthropocene, you know? But I'm walking somewhere in between those two spaces, trying to figure out what new forms of sociality might allow us to leap beyond the places that we're actually stuck in. And the places where we have all those meltdowns, because we have them because we're stuck in them, and we can't figure out how to get out of them. And my sense is that taking risks is that leap of invention.
So I'm curious. Oh, may I ask a question? Well, actually, there's no question period. Oh, I'm sorry. You're going to have to ask your question at the cocktail party. I'm sorry. You know what? I am sorry, but we have to end because the organizers are looking at me with their eyes. And Deborah has eyes too.
Oh, right.
Yes. So would you join me in thanking our colleagues for their hard work and their interventions?
Okay, so clearly this has been a brilliant 2 days. That actually is only a moment in time in, I know, what will be ongoing and incalculable impacts of Britzman's work. I thank all the presenters. I thank those who came to listen, which is its own hard work. And that doesn't exclude presenters who were listening while they weren't presenting. So I just want to convey to all of you once again a thank you. And I'd like to ask Jen to give the final thank you to the very person who we've come to honor and celebrate, the one and only. So thank you very much, everyone.